Well, good morning, everyone, to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, our 9th meeting of 2013. Could I remind members and others to turn off any mobile phones and Blackberries. We have apologies this morning from John Lamont and Dick Lyle. And that then takes us to agenda item 1, which is a decision on taking business in private. Are members content to take agenda item 3, which is an item to discuss the evidence heard from the Commissioner in private to inform our report on the consultation? Yeah. Thank you very much. That takes us to agenda item 2, which is the evidence session on the review of the Code of Practice for Ministerial Appointments to Public Bodies. And I would welcome Stuart Allen, the Public Appointments Commissioner for Scotland, to the meeting this morning, and also Ian Bruce, the Compliance Manager, the Commission for Ethical Standards in Public Life. Commissioner, if you would like to just make a short opening statement, and then the members would like to ask you, the two of you, some questions, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. When Ian and I were last before you in October last year, we explained that the intention was to carry out a consultation on the Code of Practice on Public Appointments. That concluded in November last year, and the purpose of the review really was to establish whether the Code was operating effectively and efficiently, and whether regulation was proportionate. Now, we had a very good response rate from ministers, government officials, and a range of chairs of public bodies. There are a couple of general issues that I just would like to touch on briefly from the consultation. The first one, and perhaps one of the most important points, is that the consultation process disclosed that the public appointment system itself was operating to ensure that people of high calibre were being appointed to the boards of public bodies, and therefore that the public could have confidence in the robustness of the system. It's important, since we're talking about change, to bear that in mind. There were, however, comments that the application process was not encouraging a diverse range of applications. And there was concern that scrutiny could be disproportionate and seen as driving bureaucracy rather than improvement in the process. And therefore, the code could be made to be more effective. Now, the paper that is before you proposes changes to the code, but it also indicates changes to guidance, and also there will be some recommendations to the Scottish Government, which they will be responsible for considering and, as appropriate, taking action upon. The first main change in the code is to articulate more precisely what are the principles behind the code, and I have articulated them referring to merit. Public appointments must be made on merit. Secondly, there must be openness in the entirety of the process. And thirdly, there must be diversity and equality of opportunity afforded by the process itself. Now, none of these principles were reflected in the original code, but I think they are particularly important to have on page 1. This is what the code is about. And the last one, promoting diversity and equality of opportunity, I think is fundamental to the way we see the code developing over the next few years. The second point was that the code at present proposes that skills and knowledge are the criteria for appointment, and a very considerable number of comments indicated that experience was not sufficiently taken into account. And I mean by experience, relevant experience. And we have tried to address that. The application process came in for very considerable criticism. Was regarded as inflexible, was regarded as bureaucratic, was regarded as off-putting. And one of the proposals we're setting out is that the whole process should be made a comparatively easy exercise for people to submit applications. As far as scrutiny is concerned, we're proposing that scrutiny should be much more geared to the risk of an element, and we're proposing that there should be full scrutiny of what we've called higher level appointments, and we've indicated a broad definition here which will have to be adjusted from time to time in the light of experience. And for these appointments, we're proposing that the assessors should go back as members of the selection panel. There was very strong evidence that people had very much appreciated the wisdom that assessors brought to the process. And this was a comment from chairs of the public boards, from government officials themselves. And so we felt that we would be better to grasp the nettle and redress the balance for the higher level appointments. These are the ones where perhaps the public has the greatest interest. Other appointments where some scrutiny is required, we're proposing that that be undertaken at the key stage, which is the planning process. And if all the key planning is undertaken properly, then I think we can afford to leave it to the selection panel to conclude the interviews and the appointments. But there will be a number of appointments which there is no necessity for scrutiny. It is scrutiny for scrutiny's sake. It is not achieving anything, and in certain cases we're proposing that there should be no scrutiny whatsoever, unless of course there is any indication of inappropriate activity in relation to an appointment round. If I can touch very briefly on ministers' decisions. I think it's very important that ministers are involved at key stages. One is the beginning, saying what you want from candidates. What type of candidates do you want to attract? Is there a particular group that you want to aim for? And at the end of the day, an appointment is made by the minister. That is the law. And I think it is important that, particularly in the very senior appointments, that ministers should be seen to have a personal responsibility for assessing the final selection report. And we're suggesting that for these senior appointments, ministers should very carefully consider actually meeting the candidate or candidates. Now, I don't want to preempt in any way what ministers are going to say as part of the formal consultation process, but I have been extremely heartened that they have taken this on board and that they're willing to assume these responsibilities with an element of willingness, I may say. I don't think I'm in any way pushing it. I'm really pushing it at an open door on this matter. Reappointments and extensions, just to touch on that, at the moment, the system is that you are only allowed a second appointment. I'm putting it pretty simply. But of course, it depends on the length of your appointment. Some people have a 1 year, some have a 2, some have a 4-year appointment. And it does seem to me rather inappropriate that someone is only entitled to 2 terms of 2 years, whereas someone who's been appointed for 4 years would get the benefit of 8 years. And I think the key element is, how long do you really want people on? There is a finite limit, which I think should be sought in this area, and ministers should be able to, at their discretion, appoint subject to that maximum. Now, the maximum figure we've put in is 8 years. It is a matter of judgment. It's a matter of judgment. A lot of appointments nowadays are 4-year appointments, so 2 times 4 is 8. Parliament itself has used 8 years for a whole range of parliamentary appointments. These are executive appointments, of course, but I think, by and large, I think that is just about right, and I'm commending that to Parliament. Just finally, on timescales, we got a lot of criticism that the whole process was just so bureaucratic and taking so long. And there is nothing whatsoever in the code at the moment about timescales. Now, what we're proposing is that the code should reflect the importance of appointment rounds being dealt with as efficiently and effectively as possible, and that targets should be set out in guidance for that purpose. In guidance. The targets should be used to help to ensure continuous improvement for public appointments, and should be set and be reviewed from time to time by the Government and the Commissioner jointly. Now, for the purpose of preparing the first guidance on timescales, we're proposing that the target for an appointment round would be agreed initially somewhere between 16 and 20 weeks, which would be a material improvement on current practice. And for reappointments, reappointments would require to be made at least 13 weeks before the end of the first appointment. The code that is before you is out for consultation until the 2nd of August, convener, and subject, of course, to the fullest of consideration of responses received from the Government and from the Parliament itself. I would be looking to introducing the new code with effect from the autumn of this year, hopefully October this year. Thank you very much, convener.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. That was a very full opening statement. You've answered all the questions I was going to ask you, so you can now go home. No, I'm just joking. It's actually, I feel it's very refreshing to see an approach which is designed to reduce bureaucracy and simplify things, because all too often in the public sector and in the private sector and other things as well, people tend to want to build on things and make them ever more complicated and difficult. So I'm very much in favour of simplifying processes and so on. And maybe we can start right at the beginning, in the sense that you said that the application form at the moment is very complex and puts people off, and you want to simplify that application form. I presume you've given some thought to exactly what the new application form will look like, and just, you know, how people can access it in terms of, I presume, you know, that we get paper copies or on the web or email and so on. But how little information can you take it down to keep it meaningful, and how easy do you think is that going to be in practice?
Well, I think we have to set out the objective in all this, and the objective must be to attract as many and diverse range of people to apply for posts as possible. Now, at the present time, the application process is phenomenally complicated, and I heard a great deal of evidence from, I may say, very prominent, eminent people saying that when they got their application forms to apply for posts, including chairmanships, the bundle was horrific to complete. It took days to complete. The questions were incredibly difficult. There was nothing asking them about what experience they had, what rounded experience they had. There were no questions about what vision they might have, what they could bring to the post. And one particular chairman said it was so complicated, he put the whole bundle, and it's a bundle, in the bin. He was finally persuaded to get it out and apply again. Now, that is a typical view. Now, we're wanting more diverse people to apply. We want it a simple process so that someone can say, you know, I think I've got something to offer to the public service in Scotland. I think I'll maybe dip my toe in the water and offer myself up. Now, if they get this size of paper to fill in, it's so off-putting. If we can simplify it as much as possible at stage one, without in any way trying to diminish or dilute the interview process at all, that has to be rigorous. We understand that. But if we can get people to apply, then it's essential that can be achieved if the process is simplified. Now, we've set out principles. It must be plainly put. It must be easy to understand. It must be easy to fill in. You must get more people to apply. These are the principles. But at the end of the day, it is the government that will have to shape this in relation to the specific posts they have in mind. Now, we will want to work very closely, if the code does come into operation, with government to ensure that this does come into effect, because it will mean a change to the modus operandi of government officials who are producing all the information at the moment and the questions and the application forms. They do have to be redesigned, and we will play a prominent part there, but we will be guided by the principles that we've set out.
So no template as such being suggested, because it will vary depending on the appointments?
I think we can work out some templates with the government, and I think we'd want to do it jointly to get off to a proper start here, because there is always a danger that nothing much changes. And I think we've got to really grasp this and take it on to another stage, really, to ensure that we're getting more people into the public appointments process.
Yeah, well, I'm encouraged by that, because I think that the tendency amongst officials who are doing this at the moment will be to welcome the new code and then change nothing. So there's got to be an incentive, and templates, you know, indicating the sort of minimalisation of the process, I think would actually help to focus minds, because I would suspect if it's just left for the officials to change it, they will look at what they've got and they'll think, oh gosh, I don't know what I can take out of this. And there will be a reluctance to maybe move to simplifying. And
that's a very important point.
Yeah,
Chairman.
So that's very encouraging.
Yes.
I was interested as well in your comments about the term, and I accept it's going to be a matter of judgment. So you basically settled on the 8 years because so many of these appointments are 4-year appointments and 2 terms are the norm. There was nothing more to it than that. You don't have any kind of... You're fairly flexible, and it's really up to the government, I think you're saying, to...
Yes, we had a look at leaving it at 2 times 2, but the number of times government were coming to us and said, well, this person has completed 2 terms of 2 years. We really need them to work on longer. They've got the experience now, and so we had to go through. They had to go through a formal reappointment process. I didn't see the point in it, frankly, and I think Parliament provided a lead by saying, you know, for people like commissioners, I accept their parliamentary appointments, but they're saying 8 years is the term. And after that, we think afresh. Now, probably most public bodies are running to 4-year planning cycles and so on. So if you're doing a couple of terms, I think that is just about right. Now, that does not mean to say if, for example, the government were choosing to introduce changes to a public body and people were up at the end of their 2nd term, they couldn't be extended for a year or a couple of years while legislation was being contemplated. We're allowing that in the exceptional circumstances section. So there's an inbuilt flexibility, but broadly we're saying you get 8 years, and that should be all you're expecting. And I think that will send a message to applicants as well, saying, well, you know, how long will I be expected to give to the public service in this area? And I think that's helpful.
And would the 8 years apply to someone, let's say, who comes in as an ordinary member of a board or whatever, but then gets appointed as the chairman or convener of the board? Would there be any exceptions? Because someone might have done 8 years and have done an excellent job, and yes, the board might think that that person would make a very good convener, but if they've done their 8 years, that would be them out. So would you think there might be a
yes,
space for...
The position really is, convener, that the 8 years is related to the particular post to which you've been appointed. So if you've been appointed as a member, you get your 2 terms, 8 years. But if in the 6th, 7th year you apply for the chairmanship, you're separately appointed by the minister, you will get another term. We don't want to lose that experience. If people have built up that experience, but they're then appointed to a chairmanship, they can then get 1 and possibly 2 terms of that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. The other very interesting point, I thought your code in the report was excellent. I enjoyed reading it. The point about the ministers meeting the candidates, I think is a very valid one. I don't know whether that happens at all at the moment, but ministers will be given a selection of names, and they decide on the basis of a report. And I think it would be very useful. Are you content that I suppose ultimately it's up to the ministers and the government to decide on that, but is there any way that they could be encouraged to do this as a matter of course? And you did say you were pushing an open door. I wonder if you could elaborate your views on this and how important you would feel ministers meeting the candidates and doing a final interview, if you like, of the, say, 3 people who were nominated, or 2 or 3. Or
yes, I attach a lot of importance to this. Let me deal with what is the current practice. There is no pattern. Some ministers do see candidates, others don't, and it varies from department to department for no particular reason. Some ministers take a greater interest in it. And I think there has to be some principle introduced to this. I'm not saying, first of all, that ministers have to see candidates. I'm not insisting on that. But I think for the higher level appointments, where there is a big public expectation about what these prospective chairs can deliver for the public, these people should be subject to an overview by the minister. And so I'm encouraging them. Now, the discussions I've had at ministerial level have left me greatly encouraged there, that ministers will respect that and be willing to do that. I think it's just that's the way it's been. And we don't see candidates. Well, I'm saying I think you should see them, because if you see the white of somebody's eyes, you know what sort of person they are, what vision they can bring to the public body. Is that a shared vision? Now, you cannot get that just from reading a selection panel report. You can't get that there. So I'd hope, particularly for the most senior appointments, ministers would take that on board, and I'm very hopeful that they will take that on, Convener.
Thank you very much. I did like the way that you're proposing to separate out the different types of appointments and have different criteria applying to high level and medium and lower level appointments, if we can put it like that. Do you think that the code should even suggest that there should be a presumption in favour of ministers meeting for higher level appointments, or are you content to leave it in a more kind of broad way?
I think, depending on how you read what we've put in the code, I'm regarding it as a presumption that they should be doing it. It's perhaps too subtle the way it's been put, but that's exactly what I'm looking for. There's a presumption, and the minister's got to come up with a pretty cogent reason not to see candidates for these senior appointments.
Okay, thank you very much. Helen.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Nice to see you here this morning. One of the concerns that the committee has is whether you feel satisfied that the code gives you sufficient powers to situations where you feel the code is not being complied with.
Yes, well, I think you've got to go back to the Act itself to see what powers the Commissioner has. And he has the right to look at non-compliance by ministers at really any stage of the process. And of course, he's under a legal obligation to report material non-compliance to the Parliament itself. Now, a lot of the non-compliance reports in the past may not have been terribly requiring of a formal report to Parliament. It's the process itself that really needs a good shake-up. And if we can get the process improved, then I think the need for compliance really reduces dramatically. But there is an element of extending and having some trust in the people who are running the appointment process. And I think the office, to some extent, over-regulated these appointments at the moment. But to come back and conclude in relation to the point that you specifically put to me, Vice Convener, I think there is very clear power in the Act to interfere and regulate where there is any suggestion of non-compliance with the code.
It's very helpful. I suppose the follow-on from that would be is that given that for some appointments the assessors will no longer be required to produce compliance reports, how will non-compliance be identified?
Well, I think this is part of the package that is offered. For the most senior appointments, the assessor becomes a member of the panel, is there at the entirety of the process, so there is no question of non-compliance for these senior appointments. For the middle band, the assessor will be involved in the process right up to the appointment plan, so the planning of the adverts, the planning of the questions, the timetabling, and all that is actually approved by the assessor. It's only the interviews themselves that are left to the selection panel and to the minister. There's no need for a compliance in that score. And in the last category, there is no compliance because it's not considered proportionate. There is no need for compliance. If someone wants to complain about a process in the third category, then we do come in, we will come in, and we will scrutinise the entirety of the... But if there is no issue involved, then it is unnecessary and a waste of public funds for us to really be duplicating everything that the government are themselves doing in the process.
Very helpful. I think that one of the other concerns that we have is you've spoken this morning about the level of scrutiny and reducing that level of scrutiny, and you've talked about the savings that would emerge as a consequence. Has there been any figures put on the savings of what you would anticipate these might be?
Well, I'm looking for savings 5–10% in the public appointments budget and so on. But I think there are consequential savings that will be made at government level because we are simplifying the whole process. We're reducing scrutiny, we're reducing regulation, and there are bound to be consequential savings there. But I wouldn't like to presume at this stage what they will be, because we've got a bit of discussion to take place with the government. So I'm sorry if I can't put a specific figure on it yet, because I think I would be pulling a figure out of the air, but I'm very confident we can make some savings. I'm also confident that government themselves will be able to effect savings in the appointment area.
I think it's fair enough. It makes common sense that you know, there would be an element of savings. I suppose it's just something that the committee had hoped. But I mean, I totally understand where you're at with that. But I suppose the next question that follows on is, what assurances can you provide that compliance will be rigorously monitored despite the reduced level of scrutiny?
Well, I think first of all, if you're talking about the most senior appointments, you're guaranteed that all appointments are compliant. They are, because the assessor is there the whole time as a member of the panel. In other cases, you are saying that the whole process has been approved by the assessor. And in other cases, I've said there is no need for compliance. There's no case being made for a duplicating compliance regime being applied. But if someone comes along with complaints about the process, we will investigate them. Now, as part of this package, we've said we will carry out an annual or thematic review of cases. Now, whether we do it by taking a percentage of appointment rounds throughout the year, or whether we do it by directing it at departments where perhaps there has been some concern as to whether they have been fully compliant with the code, I'm not sure. We'll just have to play it a bit by ear. But there will be, in the annual report of the Commissioner, a chapter about compliance and whether we are satisfied that the code is still maintaining the standards which have been set, and that compliance is still no longer an issue, and that's terribly important. But we'll have to learn as we go there.
Thank you very much,
Fiona, I think, did you want to come in on?
Good morning. Could I explore a wee bit further the non-compliance and the risk assessment for when you involve an assessor? When you say that for the high level, the assessor will be on the panel, and for the medium level, the assessor is in the planning process. Would it be unnecessarily bureaucratic for at both those points, at the end of both those points, for the assessor still to do a short compliance report, so that you've got on paper? You're saying that the presence of the assessor is enough to show whether there's compliance or non-compliance. I wonder if there's just a sort of certificate of, yes, I was there and I'm happy. Would that be unnecessarily bureaucratic?
I think the phrase unnecessarily bureaucratic is putting it rather strong, but I don't really see the point in it. If the assessor is there, has been a member of the panel, and has any concern whatsoever about it, he or she has to report to me and say, there is a problem here. And I come in and say, just hold it, let's correct what we're doing here. So that's part of that's the same with the middle range, where all the planning is done. And that's where the guts of the whole process is all agreed. Who are we going to, where are we going to advertise? What is the advertisement going to say? What are the criteria? What skills, what experience are we looking for? When are we going to advertise? When are we going to interview? That whole process has to be effectively rubber stamped. Now, we could ask for a compliance report there, but again, it's up to the assessor to come back and say if there's a problem. I would rather we stood back and respected the government and saying, you know, you have a responsibility. After all, at the end of the day, they have the paramount responsibility of making the appointments. And I think that is sufficient. We're trusting them to get it right, in the full knowledge that if there is anything that the assessors are concerned about, they can come, and we will. We will, without any equivocation, go back to the government and say, we want to look afresh at what you're proposing in this area. But I think, just to put it a little bit in context, what was happening under the old compliance system was that in the low categories, there was only a compliance report done at the very end of the process. So this was looking at the entirety of the process from day one to appointment. And points were coming up saying, well, what you did at day one was, I think, maybe non-compliant. Now, what on earth is the point in that? A year's passed, and there's something wrong at the start, so it's non-compliant, maybe even materially non-compliant. That wasn't doing anybody any good. It was achieving nothing. It was creating a massive amount of paperwork to no purpose. If there is a problem, let's identify it and let's sort it out. And if for the larger post, let's make sure we're in there, and so there's no problem whatsoever, so that the public have the confidence in the robustness of our system.
So you see the assessor's role is becoming much more dynamic in the whole process now?
I think for the higher level appointments, it's effectively reverting to what they were doing pre-2011 code. Yes. I would like to. I get every week or so a report in from the chairs of public bodies or the chairman of selection panels about how the assessors have done. They are virtually always extremely enthusiastic and supportive of what the assessor has done, and I want to build on that.
Follow up on the risk assessment criteria.
Yeah, on you go.
For the 3 levels, and you've got the risk assessment criteria, I think, at 4.25. I just had a couple of thoughts in there looking at the 5 points you'd put in, and I wondered if there should also be points on one flag would be the recent performance of the body, and another flag might be recent performance of members of the body. If there had been concerns about, because they are not there in your 5 criteria, and if a body had perhaps been concerning to you, or a member of it had been concerning to you, should they be flagged as part of the criteria process for risk assessment?
Yes, I think that's quite a reasonable point, actually. This is obviously geared at candidates, but nevertheless, the public interest is going to take into account how well the board have done in the past, and if there have been problems with it, then that would be a factor. We say at 4 the level of public interest in the functions of the public body. That's really what I meant by that was, are the public really concerned about the public body in some way, so that they really want to know that appointment is being scrutinised? And I'll be very happy to look at expanding that to take into account including the recent performance of the body, if that helps to clarify and make that more explicit. I think that's a very good point.
On the performance of members, that's just from my experience of having been a board member. I think if members aren't performing well on a board, it kind of flags up that possibly the board's not functioning as well as it could be. Just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Right. Margaret, do you want to come in here?
Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning, Mr Bruce. You've sort of given an overview of the assessor's involvement in the appointment process, but can you tell me to what extent will the role of the assessor change?
Yeah, I'll happily answer that. You'll probably have gathered from what Stuart said, the assessors are, at this point in time, particularly proactive, and their involvement is very much appreciated. I'd anticipate that the role will be slightly different, depending on the level of appointment that they're being involved in. Obviously, as Stuart has said, for senior appointments, they will be panel members effectively, and they will be involved in collective decision-making to that extent for the entire process. At the medium level of appointment round, to an extent, they will be acting as consultants. I mean, certainly they will be there as guardians of the code, and to ensure that things are done in an appropriate way. But at the same time, there is an opportunity for them at that point to inject their expertise into the process. We do know that there's much more interest at this stage from ministers and from government in trying new things to make boards more diverse. They will, and we are encouraging them to try new approaches. Obviously, I think it's important that they have access to expertise in the form of our assessors to help them and to encourage them to go down new routes whilst ensuring that the code's requirements are still being met. So a very proactive role. It's not the policeman in the corner. They are there to talk from 8 years' experience, expertise in recruitment and selection, diversity and equality, and to inject their knowledge. And I mean, we are at the end of the day in a transitional period here. We have spoken about reductions in budgets, and it's something that we've done as an organisation year on year. And obviously, eventually, what we would hope is that panels independently will manage these things and have that knowledge and expertise themselves. But at the moment, certainly, the role that we foresee for our assessors is to help to create a process that we can all be proud of.
And finally, what training will be provided to panel members regarding the revised code?
Let me pick that up. Sure. I've already organised training for the central team, which is within government, PACE, and our assessors. We actually now run joint days for PACE and for the assessors to make sure that everyone's on the same page, shares an understanding of what ought to be done and how to achieve, I suppose, ministerial ambitions for this process. Independently, we've also set up a couple of days for the assessors in September and October to have a chat with them about the revised role in certain circumstances. We are speaking to PACE at the moment about setting up workshops for panels again, which we did when the 2011 code was introduced. And I would hope that they'll be coming forward with some dates for those quite soon, again to take place in the autumn, so just-in-time training really. And our plan at the moment is for myself and the PACE managers to jointly run these sessions. It won't just be on the code, it will also be on diversity and equality, best practice in recruitment and selection at a senior level. And I would hope to run those perpetually thereafter. So certainly a couple in the autumn that we hope that probably Victoria Quay or somewhere like that, that government will facilitate. I would hope again that the whip will be on panel members this time to attend these. And then thereafter, perhaps twice a year, just so that new people coming on board have an opportunity to get that training.
Excellent, thank you very much.
Not at all.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Fiona, I think you've...
Just to follow up on that,
points,
that was really reassuring, because at 418 in your report I've actually got a question mark, because you've said there was no enthusiasm for requiring members of the selection panel to have received specific training on the responsibilities prior to taking up the role. But you've just kind of negated all that and said there will be, as Margaret referred to, CPD.
Absolutely.
I just found that very confusing at 418.
That's what people told us
Right.
at the end of the day, but that certainly doesn't preclude us providing it. And my understanding is that a very senior level in government, they feel that it's an appropriate thing to lay on, and that they will be persuading panel members that it's well worth their while to attend. So,
I think in 418 the key point was that there wasn't enthusiasm for requiring people to do training, which does happen in England, Northern Ireland. You must receive training before you can be a selection panel member. There wasn't much enthusiasm for that, but people readily embraced the idea, if there is training provided, we will go on it. And one of the things we're thinking about is making having a training programme at a set time every year, like a spring one and an autumn one, and saying to selection panel people, look, remember we've got our spring induction programme coming up, why don't you come along to that? And hopefully over a year or two we'll try and attract everyone who is an active panel member to come along to these and hopefully get the benefit of that induction.
Explore that just a wee bit further.
Yeah.
I was a member of the Children's Panel Advisory Committee. Now, I didn't have training before I was appointed to the board, But in order to stay on that committee, I had to attend my training. It wasn't a hope, because I was selecting panel members. Therefore, I had to keep my training and selection processes completely up to date, or I wouldn't have been reappointed. I leave that one with you.
Yes, indeed.
I presume that if panel members didn't go to the training, then when it came up to a reappointment, let's say, you know, for a second term or a session or whatever, that would be taken into consideration. Their CV is going to look much better if they've attended the training sessions that were offered, because it shows a willingness to learn, a willingness to change and all the rest of it. So
I think that's absolutely right. I agree entirely with that, convener. The point about having a fixed training day in the spring and autumn is that we can go to these people who are important and busy people, and they can plan ahead and say, oh, I've got that in my diary. I bet if I can't go in the spring, I will definitely go in the autumn. But since that wasn't available, I think that created the problems. Somebody said, oh, here's a training programme coming up in a fortnight, I've got something else on. The more we can plan this, I think the better it will be for those that we're trying to encourage to attend.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Helen, you wanted to come back in, did you?
No, it's fine.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. George.
I've got question 11, sorry, is that what you mean?
Yes, that was
sorry. Right, I thought you meant continuing that theme. I think one of the concerns that the committee had was why you considered it important to include experience in the criteria. We thought that was obviously an issue.
Yes, well, if I can put it this way, I think any selection panel would want to know what experience that person can bring to a post. And I've always found it a very narrow idea of concentrating purely on specific competences. That, of course, has to be the basis of the appointment. You want to appoint on merit based on the skills that people have. But there are wider things in the case of public appointments, and I think candidates expect at some stage to be able to say, by the way, this is what I've done in my life so far that might be relevant to it. Now, it's very easy to confuse experience with age. The two are quite different things. You may well be a comparatively young person and have considerable experience of specific public services. Now, at the present time, we have very, very few younger people in public offices. They may have experience of public services, but they're not coming in and to put their names forward for boards, and that's part of our diversity push. We would like to see that addressed. Candidates themselves expect someone to ask them, say, what have you done that you think is important you can bring to the post, rather than having these very targeted questions, which people find great difficulty in filling in. I've looked at a whole range of them. First of all, the package is enormously thick. You know, it would take, I would think, at least a couple of days to fill in these forms properly. That's not what you want. If somebody can then write in some, you can have a much simpler system, and somebody attaches a CV to say, by the way, this is what I've done. What is wrong with that? It's openness. It's transparency. They're saying, this is what I'm bringing to bear, instead of concentrating purely on a competency regime, which I still think is very important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And it's perhaps not what ministers are perhaps looking for as well. They're looking sometimes for people that have an experience of, in the particular area, whether it's a health board or a college or whatever. They're looking for that. They're perhaps looking for younger people, maybe looking for more women, maybe looking for disabled. So let's bring that out in a CV or equivalent. Or make sure that the opportunity is provided to the candidate to say, this is what I think I can bring to the post, because that's missing entirely at the moment. One final point, I think the importance of experience is now being reflected in the legislative process. The recent things like the Victims and Witnesses Bill have experience in. The social care legislation has that in it. So the trend now is, I'm glad to see, is including not just skills and knowledge, but skills, knowledge and experience. And I welcome the government's extension in that direction.
It's really helpful, Convener. I think, you know, the very fact that you're alive to all the diversity issues, I think, yeah, it's really important for the committee to be assured of that. And I think that one of the questions I'd like you to maybe inform us about is, you know, the feedback that you had from the equality groups on these issues, because, I mean, I think that we all want to be really sure that, you know, in terms of diversification, including all the groups that you've just mentioned, and that the revised code will make sure that we actually embrace and give opportunities for that wider range of opportunities from you know, society.
Yes, well, I think the first point really is that I was completely taken aback that the code itself made no reference whatsoever to diversity and equality of opportunity. I couldn't understand that, because these are key statutory requirements in making public appointments. It's actually in the Act. You've got to have regard to that. And I saw it as an absolute key pillar for the code, and that's so we put that in. Inclusion Scotland made a very interesting point when they responded. They told us that by broadening the criteria to include life skills and activities such as engagement with policy processes via disabled people's organisations, which many of our members consulted on, the appointment process have plenty of experience of. The appointments would gain the advantage of a diverse workforce that can offer a multitude of skills and experience. And I think that kind of says it all. I thought it was a very useful point to make, and that really helped us, that really informed us in coming to the view that we should extend the criteria to include experience.
Well, thank you, Commissioner.
Could I perhaps just offer one small additional thing that the committee may or may not be aware, but we are now running an applicant survey as a matter of course, and it's a regular thing, and we publish the results on our website. And we are talking about, you know, every applicant who has applied for a public body position has an opportunity to complete this survey. It's an online survey. It's done by way of SurveyMonkey. The results are published, and one of the messages that we got across loud and clear was that people felt, the majority of applicants felt, that they wanted to let panels know about their experiences and felt that they just weren't given that opportunity. And, you know, we'll continue to run that survey, but clearly that, you know, they are key stakeholders, and that has to inform the developments that we make.
Grateful for that. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Fiona?
I know that the convener was asking about the application process, and we're talking about how we ensure diversity, and I'm just slightly concerned with the very last thing you said, which is good, SurveyMonkey, etc. But there's a lot of people that we want to attract into this whole area that don't use the internet. Yes. And if we, you know, so it's about moving beyond application forms, CVs, internet access, and working out, you know, a way of suggesting how applications can be presented in different formats. Yes. Because that's the way we will encourage more people. Young folk might want to send in a video of themselves as their application process. Things like that. I just, you know, hope that there's guidance we can put out about.
Well, so the guidance is one way of doing it, but this is absolutely key. You know, how you advertise, how do you get out to people and say apply? How do you do that? And I think the government have been are really convinced that we have to do things more imaginatively, and we've been at meeting with ministers and officials where I think they are taking this on board, that they do have to think outside the box to some extent, because otherwise you won't be targeting. The little box in the Sunday Herald's all very well, but you know, what evidence is there that that's going to attract people that are not at the moment putting in an application? So we've got to think of, you know, what can we get much better results? How do we do that? Well, we've got to be thinking a lot more imaginatively before we're going to make any inroads there.
Maybe if I could just follow up on that general point about advertising and so on. I think you say that's entirely up to the body that's going to be looking for people. Do you feel that there needs to be some kind of overseeing of how they're doing that? Just getting back to Fiona's point, you know, in terms of attracting people in the widest sense.
I'm not sure it's overseeing that's required, but I think in the office there's a lot of expertise about how we could attract more people in, and I think we've got to work a lot more closely with Scottish Government officials there. But equally, Scottish Government officials must come out of the mindset of just doing everything traditionally. That is not going to attract more people into the system. But I am very heartened by their response to the initial paper, and they are coming up with their own ideas, which I've been very taken with, actually. So together, hopefully, we can come up with some more imaginative processes that will achieve a better result.
Mm-hmm. And you'll be reporting on that in due course anyway,
yes,
so
yes.
that we'll be able to have a look at reports in the future as to
absolutely,
whether you know, these changes have been implemented and whether they're working. I was particularly taken by the comment about people applying by video. I mean, folk who are dyslexic, for instance, would have a real struggle in dealing with the written thing. But very often they've got excellent memories, they're quite very intelligent, and they can articulate verbally very, very well indeed. So, you know, I think we do need, especially, I suppose, well, generally to get them onto different boards, but maybe especially on boards that we're looking at those particular subject areas where they're going to have experience of how the system has dealt with them, if you like, you know.
Yeah.
We have engaged in quite a bit of outreach activity, and you know, you're absolutely right, it's very important. Stuart mentioned Inclusion Scotland, and we actually went all over the country to engage with people who hadn't previously thought about themselves, you know, having a board member position. And we just need to keep that up, I think, along with government. And you know, there are a whole range of communities. We ran similar events for the Officers Association Scotland, so people who'd come out of the services with skill sets that, you know, boards might particularly appreciate. And I know that government have a women's event, quite a significant one planned, that they're in the course of planning at the moment, which I think will take place, hopefully, prior to the launch of the revised code. But it's something that has to be kept up. Yeah.
Thank you. George?
Thank you, Convener. Morning, gentlemen. I'd just like to, I take on board what the Commissioner said about having trust in people running the process, but we live in cynical times. And one of the questions I'd like to ask is about the code is there's a section, Section H, exceptional circumstances, and it gives a list of, it does say it's not a comprehensive list, but it gives a list of ill health and various things like that. Members died, that they'd have to do something to replace someone, they've changed things because of exceptional circumstances. How would we know that, is there a mechanism in place to ensure that these exceptional circumstances wouldn't be used constantly or used as an excuse not to go through the process, bearing in mind we do live in cynical times?
I take that point. It is part of our responsibility that when a minister comes to us and say, we have a difficult position here, would you be willing that we could go down this route because of whatever circumstances? We have a responsibility there to take, in the public interest, to decide whether that is appropriate or not, and to grant authority to do so or not. But we in turn have a responsibility to Parliament to explain when this has occasioned, and I'd be very happy that we include that in our annual report. I'm not expecting this to be used But I do take your point that how can you be satisfied it's not being overused? And certainly I can give you an assurance that we will include an exceptional circumstances section in our annual report so that you can see clearly when these powers have been used.
Okay. Something else as well, some of the respondees to the actual actually said to us that the Scottish Government's idea practice of anonymising application forms, it's not part of the code, but they do it anyway pre-interview. Now, some of the respondees actually mentioned that they found this quite unhelpful for themselves with regards to that. So what is your view on that?
Well, I think to require anonymity at the stage prior to interview is quite disingenuous and goes completely against the principles of openness and transparency. There is no requirement in the code, in the current code, for anonymity to be required at selection panel level before interview. And, you know, as a matter of sheer a simple observation, you know, it is so easy, particularly here in Scotland where everybody knows everybody. They know fine who candidate A is. And so, as I say, I think it's quite disingenuous. And I think we've got to respect selection panels and say, these are the details of applicant A, including their name and everything else. Why not? You know, otherwise you're saying we don't trust panels. Is that what we're saying? That is what we're saying. And I'm sorry, that's just not. That's
To say, from my own perspective, having been in selection panels at a local government level, it was bizarre because you ended up knowing the CVs. Because you could actually, there's a certain submarine commander that applies for every job in Ramshaw Council, and you ended up knowing not who they were, but you were aware of the position as well. Can I ask another question as well? Is will the revised code actually be reviewed after a certain period of time?
Yes, I thought I would be asked this, and I have set about the code so that I think it's a very firm foundation for the longer term. But it's up to Parliament and the Commissioner whether they want to review it. Statutorily, it's up to the Commissioner if he wants to review it at any time. I'm hoping the code will stand the test of time. I wouldn't have written it otherwise. And I stand by that. That is not to say we won't learn. There are a whole number of issues that have been brought up today that I'll want to think about in perhaps writing in the final version of the code. You've got to learn from, and things may not go the way that we've planned, and of course we will then review it. But I am confident that it's a document that will stand the test of time, and I wouldn't be looking for an early review, certainly of any major points in the code.
Helen?
I've just got one small point, and that is that I have heard anecdotally of instances where applicants for posts have had a response back from government to say that they've been overqualified for the job and haven't really merited in that regard then the opportunity for an interview to explain why it is that they may be sort of almost downsizing themselves to an opportunity. And I just wonder, you know, what the sort of thinking is about that, because that strikes me as, you know, sometimes individuals will have very particular instances where there's sound reasons as to why they want to go for a job that's perhaps seen by others as being beneath them.
I'm not sure that perhaps entirely reflects appointments to members of public bodies in Scotland rather than ordinary appointments within the civil service and so on. Ian, do you want to make any comment on that?
I am frankly astonished, but I would, you've mentioned anecdotally, I would love to hear from any applicants who have had that experience of the public appointments process. It's not something I've ever heard of. I know government are working very hard now on providing good quality feedback, because that's one of the things that applicants said is, can we have better feedback? I've never heard anyone tell us that, but please have them, please have them get in touch with us, because that I wouldn't anticipate anyone being told that at the end of an appointments process. If you've been told you've not been successful, it should be in terms of the criteria for selection. Yeah. To be advised you're overqualified makes no sense to me at all, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Fiona, I think you wanted to come back in.
Thank you. Just one final point. It was on the anonymising bit. And without wanting to impugn the integrity of selection panels, my understanding is that anonymising was brought in as part of the process of widening, who we appoint, because there may be inherent biases that we don't know we've got, that when we see a name, we don't then take that any further, because for whatever reason. And that was my understanding for anonymising being brought in. Is this now an old-fashioned way of achieving diversity? And so if we do away with it, are we sure that we will still achieve diversity?
Sure. Anonymisation is one tool, and it is, at the end of the day, only one tool. I mean, the code hasn't changed in respect of personal bias, so it still does include a paragraph that clearly says that the process that you use should seek to eliminate personal bias. The situation that we face in Scotland, I think Stuart has acquainted you with, but an awful lot of the time, at least a proportion of candidates are known, and a proportion aren't. And at the end of the day, what we want is a process that treats you fairly, whether you are known or not. But anonymity clearly doesn't work in respect of known candidates. So, but what we are saying is that panel members ought to be trained. You ought to work as a panel. You need to have clear criteria for selection. We involve an assessor in appointment rounds. So these are all additional tools that one can use to ensure that fairness is achieved in an appointments process. I know very well, we are very familiar with the evidence about unconscious bias, but more often than not, the studies involve a single individual looking at CVs. Oh, it's a woman's name, it's a man's name, and scoring the men more highly because of that unconscious bias. Studies clearly also indicate that when you do involve panels, when you have clear criteria for selection that are well articulated and panels have been trained, then assessment is done fairly. So, I think from our perspective, there's sufficient checks and balances in to mean that insisting on anonymity, which some people do consider to be a fig leaf for reasons that I've already articulated, isn't necessarily helpful.
Yeah, I just, it is. I think you're nearly convincing me, but I'm still not totally convinced, because we are joking about everybody in Scotland knows everybody, but we don't. It's only because a very small pool of applicants applies for things that we start to recognise, even anonymised, who they are. And at the point of what we're here to do is to try and make sure the pool is so much wider that we stop getting this usual suspects.
I agree, absolutely, and that's about changing the process. And it's not just the process, it's what happens thereafter as well, board support, etc. It's all part of a continuum. But I personally have been very encouraged by what government have been saying to us recently about all of the things that they plan to do to improve the process and to bring about some significant change. So yeah, I fully take on board the point that you're making about anonymity. But as I say, I think we have sufficient other things in place so that when new people do come forward, they're going to get a fair crack of the whip. Competency-based assessment, Stuart's mentioned a few times, and to an extent, I think that's been relied upon because people consider it to be a level playing field. But what we have established, I think, from talking to a whole range of stakeholders, is that not everyone necessarily knows the rules. And, a level playing field when you don't always know the rules means, you might get caught in the offside trap more often than the opposition. So there are a number of things that we have to do, and that's, you know, I don't think pivotal from our perspective.
Do you think that anonymising may actually work against those who are anonymised, in the sense that if there are people who panellists recognise, despite the anonymity, that the unconscious bias would take them towards those folk who they recognise anyway, and those they don't recognise, who are likely to be the newer ones that we're trying to attract in, you know, might well suffer because of this unconscious bias of folk thinking, well, we've got 10 people here to consider. Well, I know A, B, C and D because it's pretty obvious to me, but I don't know the others. Therefore, I'm going to stick with something I know. So if it's open, there's maybe less likelihood of that happening. I mean, is that something you would agree with? Or
I think it's down to the criteria for selection. If they're properly articulated, then, you know, all one really considers is the evidence that you're provided with. And that can be by way of, you know, competency-based assessment, where someone has to give a worked example, which we know proves a barrier to folk from the private sector, for example, which is, you know, so there's inherent bias in that system, just in terms of people who have experience of completing forms in that way. There is some inherent bias. But equally, if one were looking for particular types of experience, you know, one either has it or one doesn't. And if it's set out in a form, then, you know, that's what one goes on. One doesn't go on, well, you know, I happen to know X, Y or Z, A, B or C from previous positions that I've worked in along with them, and I'd like to take that information into account. That's something that the process wouldn't allow for. You can only go on what people give you at the end of the day. That's what it is to be fair during assessment.
any other questions from the committee? No? Well, thank you very much indeed for that very useful session, and we'll be putting together a report as the committee, and we'll place that before Parliament, and you'll get it in due course, and we look forward to seeing the final version of the code. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We'll now move into private session. That ends the public part of the meeting.